Hi everyone, it's Teresa. I am just going to record Chapter 2, Microbiology, PowerPoint, the Chemistry of Life. I will tell you all that this is a pretty long chapter full of PowerPoint slides, so I am going to divide this recording up into two separate videos and link them to my YouTube channel, so you should be watching this from one of the YouTube links. So this is actually chapter 2 from your microbiology book, just for reference, and we'll go ahead and get started. So several learning objectives that I want you guys to really think about as we discuss and after this chapter. And this is about atoms, ions, chemical bonds, and chemical reactions, which, believe it or not, are very important in the study of microbiology. Some of this may be a review for some of you, especially those of you who have taken chemistry at some point in your educational career. But the first thing we're going to talk about is defining and describing matter, elements, atoms, and ions. We are also going to define and describe the atomic nucleus and define atomic weight, neutron, proton, electron, valence, and isotope. Also, you should be able to name, describe, and rank the different types of chemical bonds. After this lesson, you should be able to describe the different types of chemical reactions and define the rules of chemical notations. So we're going to start by talking about the elements. The first element that I want to talk about is matter. It's anything that occupies space and has mass. So matter can be in a liquid, gas, or solid form and is composed of elements, the smallest particles of which are called atoms. As far as elements, they cannot be broken down further by natural forces. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the periodic table of elements, which we will be discussing a little bit throughout this chapter. But very specific examples of elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. They are some of the elements that are most commonly found amongst living and in living cells. So, as I mentioned on a previous slide, atoms are the smallest particles of an element. When we talk about chemical compounds, we are talking about elements in combination. So although chemical elements usually do not exist in free form, they do occur in combinations called chemical compounds. The shorthand expression of a chemical compound is its chemical formula. So if you look here, the chemical formula of table salt or sodium chloride is NaCl. Or if we're talking about water, it's H2O. Okay, this is table 2.1. You can find this in your book in chapter 2. This is a list of the elements that are most commonly found in living cells, as I mentioned earlier. But these are elements that you are probably pretty familiar with. Now, when we talk about the atomic model, there's a few things that we need to mention. You have the atomic nucleus, and this contains protons and neutrons. And then you may have protons, which are positively charged particles. Now, these vary from element to element. And then you have neutrons that are particles without a charge, and electrons, which are negatively charged particles. And again, these all vary from element to element. So all atoms have the same fundamental structure consisting of a center or atomic nucleus and surrounding shells. Due to the different number of subatomic particles, each element has its own characteristic atomic structure. When we talk about the atomic weight, we are talking about the number of protons and neutrons. So the total of the protons and neutrons, both things, is the atomic weight. And when we talk about the atomic number, that is just the number of protons. And then electrons travel around the nucleus at high speed and occupy positions in a volume of space called an orbital or electron cloud. These orbitals form an energy level, also referred to as shells, in which the electrons usually remain. So orbitals or shells, as I just mentioned, It's a volume of space that contains electrons. Okay, and if you look here, you have a couple different figures. So figure 2.1 on the left, this shows a very simplified diagram of hydrogen and carbon atoms with the atomic nucleus containing protons and neutrons in the center of the atom, and the electron is in the surrounding shell. Okay, and you can see that with the key there on the side. And then figure 2.2 on the right illustrates the number of protons equals the number of electrons in each of these atoms, which are found in association with living systems. So now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about electron shells and orbitals. So electron shells and orbitals are energy levels around the nucleus. They do contain electrons. The number of shells depends on the atomic number. The first shell can only hold 2 electrons, and the second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. The energy level of electrons increases with the distance of their shells from the nucleus. So electrons in more distant shells have higher energy. Shells always fill sequentially from the inside out. So again, 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the next shell. And then when the outermost shell is filled, the atom is considered stable. So to give you an example, carbon with 6 electrons carries 2 electrons in the first shell and 4 in the second shell. And sodium with 11 electrons has 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 in the second shell, and then 1 in the third shell. Now we're going to talk about valence electrons. These are electrons that are in the outermost shell. They actually can participate in chemical reactions. They also determine what kind of chemical bond, if any, the atom can form. If the outermost shell is filled, the atom is stable or inert and cannot react with another atom. So to give you a couple examples, hydrogen is the very simplest element. It has an atomic number of 1, and therefore it has 1 electron in its outermost shell. So it has 1 valence electron. Helium, with the atomic number of 2, has 2 electrons in its outermost shell. The shell is fully occupied and is stable. Helium atoms will not react with each other and also cannot combine with atoms of other elements. Helium is therefore called an inert or stable gas. Now I want to talk a little bit about isotopes. So isotopes are atoms with the same number of protons, but a different number of neutrons. Atomic number of isotopes is unchanged, and their atomic weight is different. So as an example, the element hydrogen again has 2 isotopes. Hydrogen, which has 1 proton, and deuterium, which has 1 proton and 1 neutron, and tritium, which has 1 proton and 2 neutrons. So here is a picture of the isotopes of hydrogen. So this is figure 2.3 in your book. It shows that hydrogen has only 1 proton only, as you can see there. Deuterium has 1 proton and 1 neutron, and tritium has 1 proton and 2 neutrons. Okay, now we want to talk a little bit about ions. So ions are electrically charged atoms, molecules, and particles. They can be positive or negative due to an electron loss or gain. We refer to them as cations, that's a positive. Anions is a negative. And then also electrolytes are free ions that are present in solvent, for example, water. So because solvents contain ions or electrolytes, they are called ionic solutions. Chemically, they are acids, bases, and salts. Several cations and anions are important components of higher life forms. All of these higher life forms require a complex electrolyte balance, called an osmotic gradient, between their cellular and extracellular fluid compartments. So this is table 2.2, and it shows several cations and anions that are important components of higher life forms. So you see sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium are example of cations, and chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, and sulfate are all examples of anions. So now we talk about chemical bonds and molecules. So molecules form by chemical bonding between the valence electrons of atoms. So remember that valence is that outer layer of electrons. So the number of bonds possible between atoms is determined by the number of electrons needed to complete the outermost shell. So hydrogen with one electron in the outermost shell can form one chemical bond. Oxygen with 8 electrons, 2 plus 6, and therefore 6 in the outermost shell, can form 2 bonds. And carbon with 6 electrons, 4 in the outermost shell, can form up to 4 chemical bonds to fill the outermost shell. So compounds are made from atoms of different elements. And compounds have different properties than the individual elements within the compounds. Okay, covalent bonds. These result from a sharing of electrons. There's a couple different types of covalent bonds that we're going to talk about. The first one is the nonpolar covalent bond. This is an equal sharing of electrons. Covalent bonds are usually the strongest chemical bonds. I want to go back and start over on this slide, guys. Covalent bonds. These are a result from a sharing of electrons. Covalent bonds are usually the strongest chemical bonds. And when we talk about covalent bonds, there's 2 different types that we talk about, nonpolar covalent bonds and polar covalent bonds. So with nonpolar covalent bonds, it's an equal sharing of electrons. In a polar covalent bond, it's an unequal sharing of electrons. So the electrons are pulled towards the larger atom, and so the result is that one end of the molecule is more negative and the other is more positive. This is an example that's in your book of covalent bonds. On figure 2.4, you see a nonpolar covalent bond between 2 hydrogen atoms formed by an equal sharing of electrons. And then in figure 2b, this shows a polar covalent bond between an oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms, H2O, formed by an unequal sharing of electrons. So, depending on the number of electrons shared, molecules can be formed from a single covalent bond by sharing 1 pair of electrons, such as the bond between hydrogen atoms. Single covalent bonds are indicated by 1 solid line. Then there is double covalent bonds. These are formed by sharing 2 pairs of electrons as seen between oxygen atoms. These bonds are indicated by 2 solid lines. And then we also see triple covalent bonds such as nitrogen, and these bonds are indicated by 3 solid lines in between them. So when we talk about ionic bonds, we're talking about the transfer of the valence electrons from one atom to another. The forms charged atoms are called ions. So if we have a loss of electrons, we have a positive charge, and a gain of electrons, we have a more negative charge. So this is another example for those of you who are visual learners of ionic bonds that may make more sense. In the first figure on the left, you see an electron in the outermost shell of the sodium atom that is transferred to the chlorine atom, resulting in sodium to have a positive charge and a chloride to have a negative ion or negative charge. In the figure on the right, you see a crystal of sodium chloride, which is essentially table salt. The sodium and chloride ions alternate in definite, regular, and geometric pattern. So, hydrogen bonds. These are very weak chemical bonds. Hydrogen bonds have only about 5% of the strength of covalent bonds. However, when many hydrogen bonds are formed between two molecules, the resulting union can be strong enough to be considered stable. So, attraction between charged atoms within a large molecule, for example, DNA, or between adjacent molecules, example, H2O or water. And hydrogen bonds always involve a hydrogen atom, which is positive, attracted to an oxygen, which is a negative, or nitrogen, which is also negative atom. Okay, here is an example of hydrogen bonds here. These are hydrogen bonds between water molecules. The positively charged hydrogen portion of one water molecule is slightly attracted to the negatively charged oxygen portion of another water molecule. Hydrogen bonds are always indicated by dotted lines. Okay, van der Waals forces. These determine the final molecular arrangements that define selectivity and specificity properties. In other words, if there is an interaction, selectivity, how well it fits, or specificity, is a function of the van der Waals forces. Van der Waals forces explain how a spider can hang upside down from a ceiling and why a gecko can hang by one toe from a glass surface. Okay, chemical reactions. So we talk about synthesis or dehydration synthesis. It is an anabolic reaction that requires energy. It produces polymers or large molecules from monomers or small molecules by removing water. Then we talk about hydrolysis, which is a catabolic reaction where energy is released, in which polymers are broken down into monomers. These reactions require water. Here in this figure, it shows the chemical reactions of dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. Okay, when we continue to talk about chemical reactions, I'd like to mention endergonic chemical reactions. These require energy, such as occurs in the dehydration synthesis of nutrient molecules during anabolism. Then we talk about exergonic. These reactions give off energy, as an example in hydrolysis. So hydrolysis that occurs during catabolism is an exergonic reaction and releases energy. Then we talk about redox reactions or reduction oxidation reactions, in which atoms have their own oxidation number, which is called an oxidation state, and it changes. An oxidation reaction does not occur without a reduction reaction happening at the same time. So, oxidation refers to the loss of electrons, whereas reduction involves gaining electrons, and you can see this illustrated here in this figure 2.8. Okay, chemical notations. Chemical compounds and reactions are shown by chemical shorthand or chemical notation. So when we talk about the rules for chemical notations, the first rule is the abbreviation of an element represents one atom of that element and its chemical symbol. Then another rule, the number before the chemical symbol is the number of atoms. The number before the chemical formula is the number of molecules. The subscript after the chemical symbol of an element shows the number of that atom in the molecule. A superscript of plus or minus after the atomic symbol indicates an ion. Chemical reactions do not form or destroy atoms to rearrange them into new combinations. If you guys want, I've been talking for 20 minutes. This is probably a good time to take a break, get a drink, have a snack, go to the restroom. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording. It's the first part of chapter 2, and I will pick up on the second part of chapter 2 shortly.